This is Gesher, the podcast that's bridging the gap between the Jewish and evangelical Christian communities with conversations that matter. Here's your host, Ty Perry, with the Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Gesher. I'm glad to have you listening today. My guest on this episode is Dr. Guy Golan, an associate professor of strategic communication in Texas Christian University's Bob Schieffer College of Communication. Before joining academia, Guy worked as a political communications professional in Israel, working with the teams of former Prime Ministers Shimon Peres and Ehud Barak. He's also the co-author of a new book, My Brother's Keeper, The Complicated Relationship Between American Jews and Israel, and he's here to discuss that with us today. Dr. Golan, welcome to Gesher.
Okay, thanks for having me, Ty.
Well, Dr. Golan, I truly did enjoy reading this book. I think it's an invaluable book, whether you're Jewish, you're an evangelical Christian, whoever you are, you're an American. It's helpful to understand the distinction between the American Jewish community, the Israeli community, and I want to just read from the preface. There's a part here that I think really sets the tone for the rest of the book. You write, American Jews and Christians alike are often surprised when they land in Israel. Many expect Israelis to look like American Jews, like Jerry Seinfeld, Adam Sandler, Jon Stewart, or Bernie Sanders. Many expect to find bagel shops and kosher delis and have their choice of corned beef on rye. But when they step out of their cab or tour bus and walk around in Israel, they encounter unexpected sights and sounds. The Jews they see are predominantly brown, not white. The music heard on the street and on the radio is predominantly Middle Eastern, not Western. Israeli street food, likewise, is not what Europeans and Americans know as Jewish food. No bagels and cream cheese, no rugula, no brisket or tongue sandwiches. Instead, Israelis eat hummus, shawarma, or schnitzel and pita with Yemenite hot sauce on top. Israel is a typical Mediterranean country, loud and somewhat disordered, more like Greece or Turkey than the Jewish neighborhoods of Long Island, Brooklyn, or Boca Raton. You go on to say, so Israel surprises Americans because Israeli Jews do not look, think, or behave like the Jews Americans see at the office, at school, and on television. I think this really sets the stage for your book because as you seek to explain that though Israeli Jews and American Jews are of the same people, they're very different in many aspects. You term it two different tribes. And that's long been true. That's not a new development. So I have to ask, why now? What motivated you to write this book along with your co-author? Why did you write this book when you did?
Well, Ty, Israel is one of the most discussed nations on earth. We see it all the time in the news. It's a tiny country of less than 10 million people, receives more news coverage than some of the largest countries on earth. While everybody is obsessed with Israel, whether they love it or hate it, they're obsessed with it, most people are not very familiar with Israel. And chief among those are American Jews. Many American Jews know very little about the state of Israel. And our goal in this book is to fill in the gap of knowledge and provide an unbiased historical account of the Israeli people, the American Jewish people, the Jewish people all around the world, and their relationship to one another.
Well, it certainly is in the news a lot today and misunderstood, it seems, on every front. So I certainly think after reading this that this would be helpful for someone who's open-minded and does want to know more. One of the things that you discuss early on in the book in your chapter called Religion or Nation, and there's a question mark there. So it's the question of who are the Jewish people, or what is Judaism? So walk us through that I don't want to call it a controversy, but a debate. When we speak of Judaism or Jewish people, of whom or of what are we speaking?
Well, this is, as you said, the focal point of this book. It's about identity. And the identity is really important because it affects everything in our lives. For thousands of years, Jews understood themselves to be a religion, a nation, a people with a shared commonality and a shared faith, meaning that the Jews who lived in Yemen, or the Jews who lived in Eastern Europe, or the Jews who lived in Latin America, all understood themselves to be one nation. And this all changed during emancipation. And we'll talk about that a little later on, but the salience of one's religious identity, is it just a mere faith, or if you're a Jew, are you a part of a larger nation?
Mhm. Well, let's talk about emancipation. I'm not sure if most of my listeners would necessarily know exactly what you're speaking of when you speak of Jewish emancipation. So talk to us about that. What is that, and how did it impact the question of identity when it comes to the Jewish people?
Yes, we're not talking about the Emancipation Proclamation. We're talking about something that happened years before. Um, Ever since, let's talk about Eastern European Jews. Eastern European Jews lived in Europe for a very long time, and they lived separate from the non-Jewish world. So Jews would live in their own shtetl, where they mostly interacted with one another. So they lived in a close society within nations like Russia, or Poland, or Germany. And when you lived in those shtetls, you would receive, you would be immersed in Jewish culture, Jewish education, Jewish habits. Everybody married only people from their own, religion,
Mm-hmm.
and this was the way of Jews all around the world for thousands of years. However, this all changed in the late 1800s in Europe, especially in Central Europe, where Jews were offered a bargain, the bargain of emancipation. And it went as follows. If you remove your Jewish markers, if you act less Jewish, if you are willing to kind of give up the old ways and embrace the new ways, the modern ways, you can become a citizen of the nation. Meaning not only in terms of a bureaucratic citizenship, but also you're going to be accepted by the others, and that will open doors to you. So you can leave the shtetl and become a regular citizen of Germany, a regular citizen of France, a regular citizen of Holland. And guess what? Jews jumped on that deal. And many of them indeed took off the kippah, the yarmulke, took off the religious markers, abandoned the traditions of thousands of years of Judaism, and just became normal, everyday Frenchmen, Germans, Dutch. And this allowed them to not only avoid the persecution, but also step up in the social and economic ladder.
Mm.
So Jews suddenly became people who were important in those societies. They joined the political, the economic, the financial, entertainment world, and they made their mark. So the promise of emancipation, the deal that we speak about throughout this book, it started in Europe. Later, it would come to America. Jews loved emancipation. It protected them. It allowed them social mobility, but it came at a large cost.
Well, and let's talk about the cost, because as I look at Jewish history during that period, it does seem in many ways like that was a bargain that was kept, that deal was kept. And yet when we come to particularly the 30s and 40s in Europe, we see that one side of that party reneged on its bargain. So as you think about assimilation, and I shouldn't say purely assimilation, but the emancipation bargain, do you think it was a net win for the Jewish community, or did it not? That bargain was not fulfilled as promised.
So the deal worked until it didn't work, right?
Yeah.
Jews climbed up to the highest office. In the book, we discuss all the famous people who were, in top positions in the German and French and Dutch and English government and culture and banking. And they did really well.
Mm-hmm.
And it worked until it didn't work. And then Jews were thrown out of the elites, and they faced a Holocaust.
Yep.
And this was a complete tragedy. Yeah.
Well, I want to talk about one of the places where that bargain has worked pretty well, and that's here in the United States. Certainly throughout their history, the Jewish people have always been the other, whether they're in Christian lands or Muslim lands, and that's often meant extreme physical persecution as a people to varying degrees. And though anti-Semitism, certainly it's existed here in the United States, we know that there's a history there. The American Jewish experience, though, has been vastly different from that of their counterparts in Europe and throughout history. Why is that? What makes America the success story for the Jewish community here?
God bless America. The United States has been wonderful for the Jewish people because it's been wonderful for most of the immigrants who came from Eastern Europe in the 1900s, in the early 1900s, right? The Jews who came to the United States and settled in the Northeast are not very different than the German, the Irish. I mean, we have so many, the Italians, so these so-called ethnic whites who came in the early century. They were promised the American dream. The way that the United States is so different than Europe is in the fact that in the United States, then we never experienced institutional anti-Semitism.
Sure.
It's true that, here and there are people who don't like Jews, but there are people who don't like many groups, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the government never persecuted the Jewish people in the United States. And that's completely different from Europe, where government-led persecution of the Jews was a national sport for many years.
Mm. I think probably also contributing to that would be the enshrining in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, the freedom of religion, the separation of church and state in the sense that the powers are not all in one body. I would assume that has contributed to the toleration, and I mean that in the sense of really an embrace of the Jewish community in the American story.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to Zionism, I want to define that. If you believe what you hear on campuses and in the media today, you might think it was a derogatory term like Jim Crow or Nazism. I don't think that at all. And we don't at Friends of Israel, and you don't either. So define Zionism. What is Zionism actually?
Simply put, Zionism is a national movement that wanted to build a homeland for the Jewish people in their historical homeland. That's it. That's all it means. That's what Zionism is. And I am a proud Zionist because I really believe that Jews need to have their own nation for various reasons. And chief among them, the fact that many people still today, thousands of years later, are still out to get the Jewish people. And we see it every day. We saw it on October 7th and it continues.
When you say that, I'm thinking of Theodor Herzl, because when he is at, he's Theodor Herzl, for listeners who don't know, he is considered today the kind of the father of Zionism. And Herzl is a journalist at the time, and he's covering the Dreyfus affair in France. And he essentially, maybe you disagree with me, my take on it would be, he looks at how Dreyfus is being treated as a Jew, and he sees the emancipation bargain has fallen through, and there has to be a place for the Jewish people to go. Now, he wasn't insistent on it being Israel. It could have been any place in his mind, but do you see that the failure of the bargain of emancipation to have contributed to the motivations of Zionism?
Well, one has to remember that Zionism is not a rare example. I mean, in the same time that Herzl was thinking about the national homeland for the Jewish people, Estonians, Finns, Swedes were all yearning for their own nation. Now, after World War I, we saw the rise of nationalism all across the world, where, the great empires of France and England collapsed. And we saw dozens of new nations being established. So nationalism, the will of a people to have their own nation, is something that was very important in the 20th century and even in the late 19th century. And there is a reason why there is Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and it's not just one country.
I want to talk about, and because you discussed this in a chapter, American Jews and Zionism. You talk about the change in the American Jewish community's embrace of Zionism over the years. Talk to us about the view of Zionism from distinctly American Jewish community perspective.
This is a great topic, and yeah, this is a very important concept in the book. Um, American Jews have multiple identities. First and foremost, they see themselves as Americans,
Mm.
and this is something that most people don't realize. American Jews view themselves first and foremost as Americans. Their religious identity is secondary to that. But another identity that's very salient to American Jews is their identity as Democrats and members of the Democratic coalition. So when you look at public opinion polls, American Jews are by far the most consistent Democrat voters in the country after African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So American Jews have a very strong identity as members of the liberal coalition. This goes back to the days of FDR, where the Democratic coalition was built basically based on ethnic whites.
Sure.
Back then, and this is a very important identity to them. So the challenge that American Jews are facing is as follows. They have a very strong sense of themselves as members of the left, and they were very important actors in all the programs of the left in the last century and more, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everything from the labor movement, civil rights movement, gay rights movement. You're going to see American Jews leading in every single one of those movements.
Yeah.
Going back to your question, the challenge that many American Jews faced was, how do they view nationalism as a whole, right? And then how they view Jewish nationalism in particular. Well, the left changed its mind about nationalism throughout the 20th century. Early on, after World War I and World War II, the left embraced nationalism. They viewed it as very romantic. So the left in Europe supported Algerian nationalism, right, as they broke away from the French, and they supported it in South Asia, all around the world. Where things changed is right around globalization, where the concept, well, actually, right after World War II, nationalism became a kind of a bad word, right? So on one hand, we see a lot of new nations arising, and the left supported it. On the other hand, many people viewed nationalism as the reason for that, for World War II and the great tragedy that impacted Europe. What we see in globalization is a new formula for success, and that is, if we want to eradicate all the bad in the world, we need to tear down borders. We need to tear down anything that highlights differences between people. So we see the rise of globalization at the expense of nationalism. And take a look at Europe. Europe is the best example, right? Europe moves away from being a union of nations, and suddenly the EU becomes very powerful. The European Parliament becomes very powerful. They get rid of the euro. There are no real borders in Europe. Anybody from Europe can work anywhere. So the concept of a nation being a limiting negative attribute, that is viewed by the left as something very negative, right? Mm-hmm. They don't like nationalism. And guess what? Israel just sticks its thumb in the eye of the left and say, not only are we a proud nationalist state, right? We are a religious national state.
Right.
And that goes against all the tenets of the left, who view both nations and religion as something to be suspect.
You bring up a point, and I get this question all the time. So I speak in churches about Israel and the Jewish community, and you have a whole chapter devoted to this question: why are American Jews liberal? And in the thinking of evangelicals, tend to be very much conservative politically. They wonder, why would Jewish people vote for a party that, at least within recent years, has had a much cooler relationship with Israel than the Republican Party? So can you explain a little bit about that? Why are American Jews, why do they tend to vote more democratically?
This is a great question, right? So President Trump, he's quoted in the book. He doesn't understand it. He's like, look, I brought the Abraham Accords. I moved the embassy to Jerusalem. I am the number one supporter of Israel in the world, and yet most American Jews are voting for the other side, for the Democrats. Well, to go back to your answer to your question, it's simple. American Jews, their home is the Democratic Party, and their political values and sociological values are rooted in the left.
Mm.
This is their home. Now, the Democratic Party has been a steadfast supporter of the state of Israel.
Right.
They've been great supporters of Israel, with the exception of the progressive wing of the party. So in the book, we discuss the differences between the mainstream Democrats, right, and the progressive Democrats, which ironically enough is led by Bernie Sanders, who's an American Jew, right? Yeah. The progressive left has a real problem with the state of Israel. And this is a challenge that the Democratic Party is facing all the time. Right now, as we enter the next elections, you will see the national conference of the Democrats. What you saw on college campuses, you're going to see outside of the conference in Chicago. We're going to see Free Palestine everywhere. And you're going to have the American Jewish voters who are delegates in the Democratic Party, who are leaders in the Democratic Party. They're going to have to walk through those encampments where people are shouting in pro-Hamas messages. And these Democratic Jews are going to have real cognitive dissonance, right? So the answer to your question is most American Jews are going to continue to vote for the Democratic Party. They view the leadership as pro-Israel. They kind of dismiss progressives. Mm. But everything we've seen on college campuses after October 7th is serving as a warning sign, and we see more and more American Jews scratching their heads about the coalition that they have with the Democratic Party.
Sure. And it does seem as one on the outside, but certainly has an eye on what's happening in the Democratic Party, that the Democratic Party of FDR, that's not the Democratic Party of today, because of the influence of the far left on the party. And this speaks to, you bring up this matter of identity with American Jewish people. I had a friend, she was in her 90s, and she said, when times are good, my identity is an American Jew. She said, but when anybody tries to threaten Israel or the Jewish people, now I'm a Jew who happens to be an American. And she talked about that shift in identity because things have been relatively good here in the U.S. for the Jewish community. The identity has been more towards American values and the left and things like that. Whereas now you have this shift, and there's this dichotomy now between which way do I go? Do I support Israel, or do I support the party and the values that I hold dear?
Well, Ty, I'm actually going to jump in and say that I predict that most of them will stay with the Democratic Party over Israel. Mm-hmm. It's not the political party of FDR no longer. It's no longer the party of Bill Clinton.
Sure.
And a lot of it has to do, nothing to do with Israel or with the Palestinians or anything like that. It's a much bigger question. And that is, how do we view America? How do we view American exceptionalism? So when you think about Bill Clinton was the champion of American exceptionalism. America was a shining hill, right? A light on the hill, as Ronald Reagan said. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, Bill Clinton ran around the world and he championed America and American exceptionalism. He said, look, we have the right model to make the world better. So for the Democrats, for the Clinton Democrats, when you ask them, is the United States a force for good or bad in the world? Their answer is easy. It's a force for good. Mm-hmm. However, what we have today from the progressive left is a different answer. And that is, they view American exceptionalism as non-exceptional. And they view the United States as a force for bad in the world, right? And this is what we're hearing on college campuses. Now, what does this have to do with the relationship to Israel? Everything. Because what we have now on college campuses where I live, I mean, not TCU. TCU is great, but I'm saying in academia where I work and live, there is a new narrative that pretty much blames the United States, the state of Israel, and Starbucks for all the ills in the world, right? And this is where the problems come
Let's talk about the world's perception of Israel, because I've been of the opinion that, with some major exceptions, the world was once fairly supportive of Israel. They saw it as a net good for the world, and that when it was in 1967, usually is when you'd think about this, with the 6 Day War, and Israel is now the victor. The nation isn't perceived as a weak country. They're now strong, and that's when the love for the Jewish state took a turn for many in the world, because now they're the more of an oppressor. You convincingly argue that that's not the reason that the world has changed. It's actually more about changes that have taken place in the American left. And you kind of hinted at this, but talk about that rise and fall of Zionism's embrace on the political left. Why was it the change on the American left that really influenced how the world views Israel today?
Yeah. So when Israel was established, it was weak, it was poor, but the Zionist movement was a leftist movement, right? My grandmother was a communist. My grandparents settled Israel, and they lived in kibbutzes, they lived in collective societies. The Israeli political establishment was a socialist one. And as Israel progressed from a tiny, weak nation into the startup nation that it is today, it left the left. Mm-hmm. And the Israeli economy is a capitalistic economy. The Israeli people are innovators. They are high tech. You sit around in a coffee shop in Tel Aviv, everybody's talking about their new startup. This is not my grandmother's country.
Yeah.
So Israel moved away from the left in terms of its not only political identity, but also its economic model and what the Israeli people aspire for. The Israeli people aspire to be the United States. People in Israel love the United States. You see this in every public opinion poll. No nation on earth has more love for Americans than the state of Israel. And and this again goes against the narrative of the left. It doesn't like capitalism that much. It prefers socialism. It doesn't like nation states. It prefers globalized countries with no borders and no identity. And Israel is a religious country. It's not religious in its politics. I mean, it's not a theocracy in any way,
right.
But the people of Israel are religious. And it's not, you alluded to the fact that Herzl thought that Israel could be in Uganda or anywhere, right? But the Jewish people have a historical relationship with the land. And Israel could not work anywhere else. It had to be in the biblical ancestral home of the Jewish people.
Yes. Well, you mentioned that there's nobody who loves America more than Israel. And I think the flip side of that is there's really no one who loves Israel outside of the Jewish community more than evangelical Christians in the West in general. And I was wondering about your book when I got it. I hadn't opened it yet, hadn't begun reading, but I saw on the cover, and I'm looking at it here. You have kind of this overlap of the Israeli and the American flag. There's a Star of David in the middle, and then there's a crack between the two, kind of indicating this relationship that is fraught between American Jewish community and the Israeli community. And at first I thought, okay, it's going to be about that relationship alone. But then I noticed there's a cross on the cover. And so I was intrigued, and I thought, I wonder how these men are going to handle Christian Zionism, because I've read some who are very critical of Christian Zionists. They ascribe motivations to us. There are some who are at least uneasy about it, and then there are some who are very, very supportive. And I have to say, I was very pleasantly surprised by how you handled it. You didn't throw us under the bus, as is prone to be done. In fact, you quote my friend David Brogg in the book and talking about his support for and his appreciation for Christian Zionism. I want to read a couple of lines that you write about Christian Zionists so that readers kind of understand your viewpoint, and then I have some questions for you. So you write, Christian Zionists are not simply the most pro-Israel American constituency, By educating Christians on the Jewish origins and contours of Christianity, they are the most successful interfaith outreach initiative in American society. They have transformed American Christianity, delegitimizing anti-Semitism in its ranks and engendering interest in Judaism and love for the Jewish people in the hearts of their tens of millions of followers. I can tell you, as an evangelical Christian Zionist, it is who works for the Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry, you captured our heartbeat exactly. That's what we want to do. So I have to ask you this. In your opinion, what makes Christian Zionism tick? Or why is the evangelical church different from the relationship that the Jewish and Christian communities have had for centuries? What's different about that?
It's a great question. I think in Europe, you just have to go all the way back to the Romans. Jews were identified as the other from day one, and were in the opposition. And this was, the church in Europe was at the heart of anti-Semitism. And what we see in the United States is something completely different. And, a lot of people think of Christian Zionism as a new phenomenon. And in the book, we discuss the fact that Christian Zionism and Jewish Zionism grew up together at the same time.
Yes.
Which is quite incredible. I'll tell you one thing. As an Israeli, as a Jew, I am inspired daily by the love of Christian Zionism for the state of Israel and for the Jewish people. And this is something we talk about in the book. It's so important to understand. The love of Christian Zionists is not only for Israelis and people who live in Israel in the state of Israel. It's for the Jewish people wherever they are.
Yes.
Even American Jews who don't love them back, right? So don't always love them back. But Ty, you mentioned something so important. When you look at who's fighting anti-Semitism in the United States, when you look at who's championing the pro-Israeli narrative in politics and in the church, when you look at who's fighting against the BDS movement, it's the Christian Zionists. It's Christians United for Israel. It's Pastor Hagee. It's my friends in Gateway Church here in Texas. Yesterday, I attended an amazing event by a new organization called O7C. It's by Patricia and Hidden from Everybody Loves Raymond.
Oh, yes.
She organized this brand new organization, and its purpose is to build relationships between Christians and the state of Israel. So, wow, we have two completely different pictures that we see. One is college campuses, and soon we're going to see it at the Democratic Party convention, where people are yelling in favor of Hamas and the anti-Israel movement and BDS. On the other side, that's darkness in my view. It's wrong not only because they're supporting a terror organization against a democratic nation, right, and ignoring the atrocities of October 7th. There's a much larger battle at hand, and they're on the wrong side of the battle. On the other side, you see light, you see hope, you see Christians who are standing up for Israel, not because of any short-term political interest, but because of values and foundational values that come from a book.
Yes.
And that's all the difference in the world.
And that's exactly right. You actually answered a question that often comes up, or a claim that often comes up, particularly in the American Jewish community. When I introduce myself as a Christian Zionist, and I don't get this so much anymore, but I have over the years, I often would get the question, well, do you support us just because you think it will somehow hasten the return of Jesus? And I certainly believe Jesus is going to return. I believe he's the Messiah. But that was shocking to me when I heard that, because I've never even thought that. That's never even been part of my theology. And you write this, you say of this claim, yet no one can claim to have heard this from an actual evangelical Christian. This is an explanation that non-Christians give to explain to one another why evangelicals think and act as they do. And that's right. So I have to ask you this. How do you, as an Israeli, as a Jewish person, how do you answer that claim when you hear it from within the Jewish community? When they say, what's the motivation? Or they ascribe a false motivation. How do you answer that?
It's such a great topic. So, chapter 14 of our book is why do Christian Zionists love Israel? And chapter 15 is why do American Jews fear Christian Zionists, right? So, Ty, it's very important to talk about the fact that Christian Zionists not only support Israel politically, they support them financially, and they support them in so many ways. I mean, there's so many wonderful organizations, right, that bring Christians to Israel, to see Israel, to get to know Israel, to get to know the Jewish people. Christian Zionists are involved in philanthropy in Israel. They help hospitals and they help soldiers and they help the poor. I mean, they are providing so much financial support for the state of Israel. And yet, American Jews are really afraid of them. And they say, they say to the Israeli people, don't trust them. They're not really your friends. So they're only helping you. They're only on your side because they want you all to convert and they want to bring Armageddon and all that. And a lot of Christians are wondering, why is that so? Why are American Jews so suspicious of us? And the answer is, first and foremost, because American Jews and Christians are on the polar opposites of American politics. So the cold shoulder that Christian Zionists often receive, not always, but often from American Jews, is not very different from the cold shoulder that Trump supporters receive from Biden supporters.
Sure.
Right? As soon as somebody hears you support Trump, you're a persona non grata in many circles, right? Well, that's the reason. It's not because of your religion. It's not because of your religiosity. It's because American Jews are on the left and often on the left, and Christians are on the right.
Well, when I think about that, I'll tell you what my answer usually is, because many Christians will quote as their motivation from Genesis chapter 12, where God says to Abraham, "I will bless those who blesses you, and I will curse him who curses you." And I always say that's a great motivation to want blessing, but I would say it even goes deeper. And you've alluded to this, and it's that last part of what God says. He says, "And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And I think that's fundamental to understand, that Christian Zionism comes out of a deep appreciation for the Jewish people, not because we want a blessing, but because we have been blessed through them. And that's certainly our motivation at the Friends of Israel. And we appreciate very much what you've written here. I think it's a wonderful book. I want to encourage listeners to go out right now, pick up a copy of My Brother's Keeper, The Complicated Relationship Between American Jews and Israel by Guy Golan and Guy Chet. And you can get that on Amazon and probably wherever books are sold. Well, Dr. Golan, I want to thank you for writing this book and for taking the time to come on the show today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dad. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to Gesher, a ministry outreach production of FOI Equip, your free resource for learning and engaging with the scriptures from a Jewish perspective. To learn more, visit foiequip.org. And for more information about Ty, visit foi.org/Perry. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Shalom.